Good morning. My name is Benjamin Wilson. I'm joined by Bria Abbiati and Frederick Go, and today we'll be discussing our recommendations for United States foreign policy towards China. U.S. policymakers increasingly see the U.S.-Chinese rivalry not as traditional great power competition, but rather a struggle pitting democracy against authoritarianism. In July 2020, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo articulated, General Secretary Xi Jinping is a true believer in a bankrupt totalitarian ideology that informs his decades-long desire to create global hegemony for Chinese communism. In 2023, President Joe Biden labeled President Xi Jinping as a dictator after their San Francisco summit. In July 2024, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson announced, Congress must keep our focus at countering China with every tool at our disposal. What do all of these actions have in common? They represent the view that China is an expansionist, belligerent power that must be countered with every possible resource. According to this perspective, extensive resources need to be used to combat the Second Soviet Union. This perspective is misleading. Not only is the China threat overblown for numerous reasons we will discuss, but the United States has other policy priorities. The nation faces turmoil in the Middle East, war in Europe, and domestic economic instability. Given a gradually declining, risk-averse, and potentially cooperative China, exerting all of our energy towards controlling an exaggerated threat is irresponsible. Furthermore, it risks turning China into the exact bellicose power that hawks fear the nation is, which will require the United States to divert resources and energy away from other interests. By contrast, if the United States takes a more restrained and more cautious approach, the country will preserve peace and global cooperation. As such, we have three main priorities for the region. The first is avoiding war. We believe that China is a declining and largely cautious power. Preoccupied with internal issues, it will only invade Taiwan if provoked by aggressive behavior from the United States. As a result, we recommend avoiding actions that are militarily and diplomatically provocative. Proponents of a firm Chinese policy are acting as if war with China is already a foregone conclusion. This assumption is not only false, but dangerous. Treating war as inevitable will only encourage China to be increasingly aggressive and will take away the prospect of peace. Furthermore, such rampant escalation runs the risk of causing war, the exact outcome the United States would like to avoid. The second is preventing Chinese hegemony. While the United States does not want to aggressively provoke China, it cannot withdraw from the Indo-Pacific, as doing so would signal to China that it has a window of opportunity. By maintaining strategic ambiguity, a policy that has worked successfully for over 40 years, the United States will dissuade aggressive and nationalist statements from both China and Taiwan. Furthermore, by adopting a defensive posture and not getting too entangled in the region, we can decrease our myopic focus on the Indo-Pacific without signaling to China that it can act with impunity. We should recognize that the United States already has a firm presence in the region and is the strongest country in the world. Our third priority is advancing U.S. economic interests. The United States, despite being the world's wealthiest nation, faces a wide range of socioeconomic challenges. Whilst talks treat all of these issues as zero-sum, we believe that there is some room to cooperate on many global issues. A moderate U.S. approach can foster meaningful collaboration, not only on urgent issues like climate change, public health, and combating the fentanyl crisis, but also on more contentious issues, such as trade tensions and technological competition. Strategic cooperation with China can reinforce, rather than weaken, U.S. leadership in global economic and social areas. In addition, such cooperation discourages Chinese aggression and weakens the legitimacy of anti-Western rhetoric. Why are these our guiding principles? By and large, the status quo has served the United States well. China has not engaged in a hot war since 1979. Amid strategic ambiguity, which has dissuaded China from invading Taiwan for decades, China has remained peaceful. The Chinese regime, favoring stability over other ends, is extremely risk-averse. This was shown by how President Xi abandoned his unwavering zero-COVID policy after a very minor protest. China is the second most powerful country in the world, yet it has failed to make itself a regional hegemon. Additionally, China's structural, long-term economic decline has been far worse than previous expectations. its debt to GDP ratio has ballooned to over 300%. Its birth rate is less than 1.2 children per woman. What's even more striking is the unprecedented speed of this decline. This rapid decline is the direct result of China's one-child policy, further intensifying its demographic aging problem and its labor shortages. At the same time, high youth unemployment and inequality have exacerbated this decline. Overinvestment in manufacturing, infrastructure, and real estate have become increasingly unsustainable. While many experts fear a potential invasion of Taiwan, we find this scenario unlikely. Beyond the well-understood consequences of such an action, the Chinese Communist Party is extremely risk-averse. The CCP's aggressive rhetoric towards Taiwan are primarily performative, aimed at fostering nationalism rather than signaling a genuine intent to invade. Moreover, militarization of the island will be expensive, threatening to undermine China's most important objective, regime stability. Continued US provocation and fixation on the issue only plays into the CCP's game by helping it fuel nationalism. The United States is at a critical juncture. It can choose to adopt a harsh approach, risking unnecessary escalation, or adopt a more cautious approach, maintaining a stable balance of power. If the United States chooses the latter path, it increases the likelihood of both hot and cold conflict. The more the United States releases statements decrying China as an ideological foe and championing Taiwan's rights to independence, the more border disputes and acts of economic warfare it should expect. Most importantly, zero-sum logic increases the chance that Beijing launches an amphibious invasion. Conversely, by recognizing the potential for positive-sum collaboration, the United States could pursue opportunities to work with China on shared challenges. In an era shaped by unpredictable technologies like AI, international cooperation will be essential towards achieving a safer future. As COVID-19 made clear, global threats, from pandemics to climate change, demand collective action. Rising sea levels and extreme weather spare no nation, and joint efforts can enhance resilience worldwide. Economically, reducing tariffs would lay the groundwork for more constructive engagement and foster a healthier, more mutually beneficial trade relationship. Treating every issue as zero-sum competition with China would undermine both progress and stability. At the same time, we do not desire to withdraw from the region suddenly. Our solutions include enhancing deterrence without provoking China. We wish to strengthen the capabilities of our allies such that they can continue to dissuade the People's Republic from taking rash action. We will now turn to our military and regional expert, Bria Abiyati.
My name is Bria Abiyati. I'm a regional and military expert, and I will be discussing our military posture in East Asia. Our regional military goals are first, to prevent a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and further attempts by China for regional hegemony. Second, to de-escalate regional tensions and increase allies' defensive capabilities. East Asian relations are trending in an escalatory direction. This movement is not solely the fault of China itself, but also due to unnecessarily alarmist assumptions by the Biden and Trump administrations. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth recently said, "There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real and could be imminent." He said, "Our goal is to prevent war, to make the cost too high." While we share the goal of preventing war, we want to emphasize that the costs of invading Taiwan are already high enough to deter China, and substantial military buildup will only increase the threat of escalation. The argument that the United States needs to be drastically more aggressive to deter a greater Chinese threat is not only misleading, but dangerous. The foundation of American foreign policy towards China and Taiwan rests on a balance between weakness and recklessness. A hawkish stance towards China will tip the balance in favor of runaway escalation, an outcome we find to be completely avoidable. Instead, our policy stresses sustainable deterrence without escalation, making it both absolutely clear that we are not threatening China, as well as continuing to convince them that it will be unfavorable to try for hegemony. The threat to Taiwan is important, but not necessarily imminent, and deterrence is achievable while also de-escalating both diplomatically and militarily. While it's true the current status quo is in need of improvement, it has also created relative regional stability for over 40 years and prevented hot conflict. Proper management of China's increased aggression within the current balance of power will allow us to avoid direct conflict while continuing towards our regional goals. Invading Taiwan would be an extremely costly gamble for China, one that has very little chance of absolute success and very minimal benefits. Logistically, economically, and militarily, it is not in China's immediate interest to embark on a full-scale invasion of the island. That being said, China maintains its red line at Taiwanese independence, and it is of utmost importance to prevent Taiwan from towing or even crossing it. Recent diplomatic U.S. actions tipping in favor of strategic clarity and Taiwanese recognition are reckless and counterproductive. A pragmatic approach to China-Taiwan relations will de-escalate tensions through diplomacy and deterrence, avoiding actions that will invite an aggressive Chinese response. Strategic ambiguity is a policy that has functioned for over 4 decades. However, recently, the Biden and Trump administrations have been eroding their commitment to it, a trend that has heightened tensions and failed to accomplish any concrete improvement in the region. Former President Joe Biden repeatedly referred to a U.S. commitment to Taiwan's defense, comments which were later clarified by White House officials that the United States still maintained its policy of strategic ambiguity. Regardless, such comments are reckless, unnecessary, and run the risk of Taiwan declaring independence or China launching a full-scale invasion. Revitalizing strategic ambiguity means publicly reaffirming our ambiguity over defending Taiwan and refraining from any rhetoric which may suggest otherwise. In regards to Taiwan's military capabilities, we opt for working with Taiwan on a practical and effective defense weaponry increase. We propose Taiwan shift defense spending to weapons and systems that would be most useful in the event of an invasion. These purchases include sea mines, anti-ship missiles, air defense systems, and drones. Purchases of expensive offensive equipment, such as F-35 and F-16 fighter jets, Abrams tanks, and long-range missile systems, are inefficient and would be easily targeted and neutralized in the event of a Chinese assault. Furthermore, we view a massive military buildup in Taiwan as both unnecessary and provocative. But we encourage the current trajectory of increasing defense spending in Taiwan from 2.5% to 3% of GDP, which President Lai Ching-te has committed to. Diplomacy and public rhetoric should not be dismissed as merely symbolic gestures. They hold the potential for either preserving or wrecking peace and stability. We do not deny the growing influence that China has procured since the 1990s, but casting China's power as necessarily menacing overstates the threat. At the 2025 Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth repeatedly emphasized the importance of significant military buildups to counter China's malign influence in East Asia, stating clearly the readiness of the U.S. to fight and win decisively if deterrence fails. Secretary Hegseth's comments are provocative and lay the groundwork for even tenser U.S.-China confrontation. The U.S. should acknowledge China's security concerns, reiterate Chinese Communist Party legitimacy, and refrain from pointing out ideological differences. Our diplomacy should emphasize managing competition, cooperation, and common ground, rather than painting a malicious image of China. In Taiwan, President Lai Ching-te is currently on a speaking tour aimed at emphasizing the importance of Taiwanese identity and the island's incompatibility with the Chinese Communist Party. His comments provoked a response from Beijing, which stated that President Lai was betraying the nation. Such comments are exactly what our policy intends to avoid, as they impede our goals of long-term stability. President Lai risks persuading Beijing that Taiwan has abandoned any idea of peaceful reunification, making an invasion their only option. Our policy discourages separatist rhetoric, de-emphasizes issues of Taiwanese national identity, and condemns Taiwan for statements alluding to independence. When questioned, American officials will reiterate our commitment to the One China policy and emphasize Taiwan's status cannot be changed forcefully. Next, we seek assertive transparency as a valuable pathway to counter China's aggressive gray zone tactics in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. Sticking to our principle of deterrence without escalation, this policy walks a line of exposing hostile Chinese behavior to public view and subjecting them to reputational consequences, while simultaneously refraining from alarmist rhetoric. In statements regarding China's harassment of Filipino ships in the South China Sea, we will defer to international organizations such as the UN and APEC to make joint statements of condemnation. Lastly, while attempts at transparent, direct communication with Beijing have not always been successful, that does not mean they are not worth pursuing. To avoid escalation, Clarity on intentions with military movement is an effective way to do so, and it should not be abandoned altogether. Besides weak and transactional partnerships with Russia and North Korea, China has few alliances in the Indo-Pacific and abroad. On the contrary, it is surrounded by wealthy and secure US allies who, while less powerful than China individually, together pose an important check on its capabilities. Dramatic increases in US and allies' militarization of the region could risk provoking an insecure China to act on what it sees as a diminishing window of opportunity. It is necessary to avoid complacency, however, and so we will welcome increases in spending on tactical defense systems, reiterate commitments to allies, and avoid provocative military drills and actions. In practice, this means promoting Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, Vietnam, and the Philippines in their efforts to increase defense spending. Japan specifically, as the US's most important strategic ally and the second wealthiest nation in the region, should increase defense spending from 1.4% to 2% of GDP. Similar to Taiwan, this increased budget should be utilized on equipment that would effectively deter Chinese aggression without inviting direct response. This would include surveillance capabilities, drones, and intentionally defensive systems. Similarly, the US should deepen technological ties to bolster allies' capabilities and decrease dependence on US technology. Furthermore, the US should encourage inter-ally cooperation on productivity and industrial capacity, continuing a balance of power while lessening the burden on the United States. Defense Secretary Hegseth laid out the current administration's plans to deploy more advanced and combat-credible forces to the region, aiming to deter by denial along the first and second island chains. However, a smarter and more efficient defense posture, not a broader and more aggressive one, is what regional stability demands. An expansive forward presence risks inciting the very conflict it intends to prevent. While deterrence requires both strength and diplomacy, the US already possesses ample military power in the region. What is needed now is not more capability, but more effective, well-calibrated deterrence, free from apprehension, with a clear commitment to cooperation and peace. We will now turn to our economic and political expert, Frederick Go.
Hi, I'm the political and economic expert for the Chinese A-team. The United States and China have long competed in economic and technological arenas. Many assume that such competition must inevitably produce a single absolute winner. We challenge this conventional position. China's sustained economic and structural challenges undermine the notion that it poses a serious threat to US leadership in the global economy. China has also consistently demonstrated a greater willingness to cooperate than many in the US have anticipated. Its aggressive actions and rhetorics are often directed towards its domestic audience to rouse nationalism and should not be taken at face value. Taking them at face value has led to a consistent underestimation of China's openness to cooperation. Many dynamics, often framed as zero-sum games, are actually opportunities for mutual gain. With prudent management, the US-China relationship does not need to become adversarial. We therefore advocate for a strategy of broadened economic and social cooperation with China, one that eases regional tensions and reinforces rather than weakens US leadership in the global economy. China is not able to challenge US leadership due to an immense amount of structural problems. Most of those problems are long-term problems that are irreversible. Most prominent and destructive among them is the fertility crisis. China has experienced a radical decline in its total fertility rate, largely driven by the notorious one-child policy, an emblem of the regime's fundamental inflexibility and efficiency in sustaining harmful policies, a pattern that extends well beyond the fertility crisis. Also, the speed of population aging in China has already been faster than that of Japan, which is famous for its population aging crisis. Social tension is also rapidly escalating. Youth unemployment has skyrocketed despite blatant data manipulation. The gray zone in the right figure marks a period when youth unemployment data was suspended to temporarily facilitate a so-called, I quote, changing methodology. Meanwhile, inequality in China, as measured by Gini coefficient, is far higher than that of the United States, a country which is infamous for its high inequality. Underpinning such tension is a worsening economic crisis. The real estate crisis continues to worsen, delivering a destructive blow to China's middle class, whose wealth is heavily concentrated in real estate property. Industrial profits, one of the most accurate indicators of the health of China's proudest manufacturing sector, have declined for the third consecutive year despite heavy subsidies. This has fueled the rise of zombie companies surviving solely on governmental cash injections, contributing to an increasingly unsustainable debt burden. All of the above highlights the dire state of China's economic and social health now. But what is even more troubling is how the future will unfold. While a slowdown has long been anticipated by Western analysts, nearly every single major forecast has severely underestimated the scale of China's decline. It is reasonable to suggest that China's decline may outpace even the already grim 2024 projections, which are already far more pessimistic than earlier forecasts. China's decline has consistently been underestimated by Western analysts, and there is a strong reason to believe this trend is persistent. China has also overdrawn on its future resources, setting the stage for an even steeper decline ahead. Its debt-to-GDP ratio has surpassed even that of the United States, and is projected to rise faster than that of the United States. This mounting debt burden has already dragged investment growth in China down to nearly zero for years. Foreign investment turned negative for the first time in 25 years, and is projected to decline even further. Venture capital investment is a very strong and important indicator of future innovation. And even venture capital investment in AI, which is the most attractive technology, has declined so sharply. No doubt venture capital investment in other industries has nearly collapsed to absolute zero. Chinese tech stars, like electric vehicle firm BYD and AI company DeepSeek, are products a past wave of high level of investment, particularly venture capital investment. But they may have no successes, as funding for even cutting-edge technology has declined so dramatically. The Chinese companies basking in the spotlight of Western media today are probably the last great Chinese companies. And all of the above, of course, are official figures from the Chinese government, giving the Chinese government's track record of striking data falsification. We have good reason to believe that the already terrible situation I have demonstrated is actually far worse. China's structural decline ensures it will not pose a long-term strategic threat to the US, and it is also far more willing to cooperate than commonly assumed in American policy circles. China's top priority, of course, is regime survival. Therefore, many Chinese rhetorics, seemingly aggressive rhetorics and actions, are mainly used to invoke nationalism to ramp up support for the regime, and thus does not reflect the CCP's actual and real intention. Its tactics are firmly aligned with its strategy of invoking nationalism for regime stability and support. Therefore, taking China's rhetorics and actions and the face value risks a serious misjudgment when it overestimates its aggressiveness and underestimates its willingness to cooperate. In many areas where China publicly declares its position as non-negotiable, it eventually compromises, and compromises a lot, while tightly controlling domestic awareness of those concessions, revealing the nationalism-baiting nature of its many rhetorics and actions. Notable examples include its recent rare earth agreements with the US and the resumption of seafood imports from Japan. US provocation, however, only further fuels Chinese nationalism and makes the regime even less responsive to its domestic challenges, particularly in areas that concern the US the most, like consumption and welfare. For example, China allocates just 8.6% of its governmental spending to healthcare, and only 14.1% to all other welfare programs combined. In contrast, the United States spent nearly 60% of total governmental expenditure on welfare-related programs. The US found this problem extremely concerning because China diverted much of the saved resources, saved from welfare and consumption, into investment, which led into the very well-known overcapacity problem that fuels both trade tensions and technological rivalry with the US. This pattern of overinvestment is a fundamental driver of the friction between the US and China. However, China is increasingly aware that its current level of investment is unsustainable. It has led to skyrocketing debt and widespread inefficiencies. With the government acting as a poor economic allocator, China now faces a severe utilization crisis. For instance, The utilization rate of Chinese solar panels is strikingly below even 20%, resulting in massive waste. The extremely high level of investment also heavily depends on a high level of nationalism, which leaves the public willing to sacrifice consumption and welfare so the government can spend more money to invest in the great power competition. Therefore, if the US reduces provocations, it can undercut nationalism, the core enabler of China's excessive investment, making China less threatening and far more open to cooperation. Given China's sustained structural decline, its greater than expected willingness to cooperate, and the counterproductive effects of US aggression in strengthening the Chinese regime instead of weakening it, we advocate for broadened economic cooperation with China. First, the US should reduce tariffs on China, since tariffs further fuels Chinese nationalism and thus give China even more leeway to invest to challenge the US. Second, most economic analysis reveals that the US has emerged as a relative loser in the trade war. While no side truly wins in a trade war, China has proven to be remarkably resilient, while the US economy appears far less so. Tariff reductions should be based on the condition that China reduces industrial subsidies and increases consumption stimulus. China has demonstrated a clear willingness to do this. Its industrial subsidies, exemplified by subsidies on electric vehicles, have significantly decreased throughout the years. At the same time, China started to launch its first consumption stimulus plan last year, which is significantly increased this year. The US should further encourage China to take this direction by implementing effect-based removals of tariffs and limitations on technology. A friendly US-China relationship also creates opportunities to address urgent global challenges such as the fentanyl crisis, climate change, and public health. Given that the fentanyl crisis is a bipartisan priority in the US, regardless of administrations, it will serve as a compelling case in point. China has long cooperated on the fentanyl control with the US, with very little US concessions, suspending that cooperation only after former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Yet even then, a few minor rhetorical concessions from the US resumed such cooperation. China's cooperation has also proven highly effective. For instance, in 2020, after less than 1 year of China's cooperation, the US Postal Service reported that China Post was, I quote, nearly fully achieving US requirements. This same cooperative model can be extended to other critical fields, such as climate change and public health. The US can help steer China towards stabilizing its regime through welfare programs and consumption rather than dangerous nationalism. Our approach then would foster a more mutually beneficial relationship between the US and China, which can ultimately reinforce US leadership in both the global economy and the technological landscape. I will then turn into Benjamin Wilson to make the comprehensive summary of our presentation.
We'll conclude by reiterating our three major priorities: avoiding war, preventing Chinese hegemony, and advancing US social and economic interests. These points are the foundation of our recommended solution. China hawks argue that the People's Republic is an aggressive expansionist power that demands a forceful and unyielding response. Seeing China solely as an aggressor is unproductive. A foreign policy that hyper-fixates on China and treats it as a destructive power will only embolden China to be more aggressive. It will enable China's nationalist claims and make the People's Republic less likely to work with us. Not only does expending every single possible resource towards China continue to provoke aggression, but it also distracts the United States away from more important policy priorities. The United States needs to ensure that it has a sufficient presence in the Indo-Pacific to dissuade China from island hopping and expanding, but hyper-focusing on the region will detract from investing resources to mitigate challenges from climate change to public health. Treating China solely as an antagonist ignores the numerous opportunities we have for cooperation. Amidst rising sea levels and after COVID-19, we need to treat all of these issues as arenas for collaboration as opposed to competition. Otherwise, there will be significant repercussions for the United States, China, and all other countries. China is preoccupied in dealing with internal political and economic problems. We need to recognize that China is not a nation first and foremost motivated by a desire to establish global dominance, but rather motivated by the desire to maintain regime stability. Whilst we need to ensure that Beijing does not become a regional hegemon, we can recognize that there are ample opportunities to carefully manage the challenge. Our solution strikes a balance between aggressive containment and complacent ignorance. Adopting a more cooperative but cautious approach will better serve long-term U.S. interests and foster greater stability. Thank you.
We'll now take questions from our experts.
Well, okay, so since no one else wants to go, I'll go.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, so there are a lot of good things here. There was a very impressive presentation. Impressive, professional, well-articulated, well-delivered, good work. Clear argument, very effective use of evidence, good research to develop detailed, granular evidence that supports all the key elements of the presentation, very effective integration of argument and evidence, thoughtful effort to balance countervailing positions. What I like best about the whole presentation and the whole approach is you're taking a nuanced position and trying to avoid, kind of simplistic black-white dichotomies. Now, going from all the nice things to some things to think about. The great upside of the presentation is you're taking a nuanced position that avoids simple black-white alternatives. The great challenge for the presentation is you're taking a nuanced position that, right? So nuanced positions are often the hardest to sustain through all of their implications and consequences. And so what I was wondering whether we could do is push on a couple of the underlying drivers of the nuanced centrism and see if we're confident that their downstream implications, are what we think they are. So as I see it, the heart of the presentation here is an argument about Chinese PRC motive that starts with regime preservation and reasons downstream from a starting point of regime preservation as the primary goal to a fairly benign assessment of the implications for the United States. Could one argue that the same premise could lead to a very different downstream conclusion? I mean, I think many pessimists about the PRC would say, would accept the idea that regime preservation is what's motivating them, but argue that given all of the economic limitations that you so effectively present, regime preservation in an environment where heretofore has been realized through expectations of economic growth that could keep the Chinese population on board with the CCP through an argument that we may or may not be politically legitimate in the sense of realizing the aspirations of the public, but we will bring you economic growth. Right? You should accept our rule because if you do, we will make you rich. And in an environment where their ability to make you rich may be subject to all the constraints that you very effectively point out, some would argue that the CCP's emphasis on nationalism is an alternative way to get buy-in from the general population for the rule of a party that isn't politically representative, and that puts them on a pathway towards conflict with their neighbors and conflict with the United States, because the conception of nationalism they've advanced creates a whole host of territorial conflicts with basically all the neighbors in the region, and potentially with us. So I guess the question I have for the group that emerges from this long disquisition is, why wouldn't the same premise, primary Chinese interest not in world conquest but in regime preservation, necessarily lead you to a benign expectation for Chinese behavior towards its neighbors rather than a malign expectation for Chinese behavior with its neighbors?
I can answer this question. So I think China is taking a way to be aggressive, but it is taking the low risk way to be aggressive and to raise nationalism. And the reason China is doing this is because the Chinese regime is a very risk-averse and paranoid regime. Like, as Benjamin has mentioned, President Xi Jinping ended the unwavering zero-COVID policy because of very minor protests of less than 10 people. This is a paranoid regime will do. And as a result, when it is trying to raise nationalism, it knows it will only take those actions that are low risk. For example, gray zone operations. There will be very few repercussions of that actions. But invading Taiwan or invading another nation is a completely different story and will incur an enormous amount of uncertainty that the regime is paranoid about. So because of this, we believe that China will only take a benign, aggressive way that is well aligned with its strategy, which is nationalism, but it does not wish to bear with the consequences and costs.
I could ask follow-up questions, but I'm at risk of monopolizing so my colleagues can weigh in.
Okay. Rachel, would you like to?
Sure. So I will start by echoing all of Steve's very well-deserved commendations to the three of you for a coherent and solid presentation. I really appreciated how everything that you delivered was complementary to towards one another's bottom line, and I think it was a very, very effective presentation, as well as the delivery that each of you provided. Individually, I think will serve you well over the duration of your long careers that you have ahead of you. So kudos to you for starting strong. So I think I want to focus on what I see as potential ramifications of your approach and the position that you articulated, and specifically implications for American values and also for American allies. Because I think there's a implication of everything that you advanced, which leads to a story of abandonment of both of those things, or potential abandonment of both of those things. That, not wholeheartedly supporting Taiwan and potentially stepping back from traditional American allies, both rhetorically as well as in defense spending, could lead to accusations of, abandonment of democracy promotion or liberalism. And on the ally side, from a political and a military perspective, Thomas Schelling famously warned us that deterrence is far easier than reassuring our allies. And consolidating troop deployments, focusing on defensive priorities, presumably cutting financially and bottom line values, some of the U.S. offers that have been discussed up till now, all of that presents some risks, especially if I'm sitting, in a foreign capital and I'm on the receiving end of what it is you are advancing. So how do you suggest that we mitigate against the worst sort of implications for American values, as well as reassure allies that we are in fact not abandoning them to the environment?
Yeah, so largely our defense posture is not to retrench from the Indo-Pacific. It's largely to increase our capabilities and our effectiveness. So this would mean we're still supporting our allies, bolstering their defense spending, and we're still reaffirming our commitments to them. So if, Japan were to be invaded by Taiwan, we would 100% back them. That being said, our suggestions are highlighting to our allies that we're not looking to escalate the conflict, that there are tensions in the region and we want to de-escalate. We want to ensure that their equipment is effective and defensive. We're continuing to supply them with that equipment, still maintaining those ties. On this ideological side, we emphasized repeatedly in our presentation that we cannot pin this as an ideological battle between communism and liberal values. That being said, we still support free trade in the region, and we want to maintain open sort of liberal values. But we just cannot be heightening this to a sense where we're back and forth and, painting this malign picture of China. When it comes to red lines about, maintaining an openness and free trade in the region, that is important to us. But we want to de-emphasize the rhetoric of, back and forth painting China as a belligerent and malign actor. We think that is unnecessary.
I'll save my follow-ups for next time.
Okay, great work, folks. I, too, was really impressed at the quality of the presentation from the opening to the closing and the integration of all of your presentations and the very solid, very impressive use of evidence. So I want to turn a little bit to communication strategy. The first thing that you would be needing to think about if you were foreign policy professionals would be, how do you want the president and the leadership, Secretary of State, everybody who's going to be talking about China, to be presenting your case to the American people? Because this is going to require a little bit of a shift. The American people have been told that China is an aggressive threat for a while now. How are you going to make that shift to persuade the American people that this is a different approach, still strong, still supportive of allies, but not provocative, aggressive? And you've got to walk that high wire, because a lot of critics are going to say, oh, well, this looks weak. This looks like we're backing away from the assertive United States that we ought to be, and does this mean that we're not supporting our allies sufficiently? So there's a really interesting domestic communication strategy that needs to be developed here. And then, just as a second question, how would you be communicating? What methods and mechanisms would you be using to reassure not just China, China being the most important audience for reassurance, but also your allies, claiming that, arguing that we are supportive of you, we want you to do these things. And there you've got a dilemma, have you heard the term the security dilemma? Okay, so anything that you're doing to reassure your allies or to help your allies keep up their arms to a high level is going to look inevitably provocative to China. So there's some real interesting communications challenges that you've got with this very subtle approach that you're using. And again, as Steve said, the strength of it is that it's subtle and it's intricate, it's thoughtful, but the downside, especially for trying to communicate to a whole range of audiences, is that it's subtle and intricate. So how do you think you would tackle some of those challenges?
I can take the first part of that question. So on the question of addressing our domestic audiences, I mean, it's a very tough line to toe. Yeah. Clearly, we have to manage, aggressive actions in the South China Sea, and also, paint a picture that is reaffirming to a domestic political audience, which voters. I think the way we would go about it is we would emphasize that China is a strategic competitor. We would kind of reiterate that China is powerful. They are, they are legitimate in their ability to compete on the world stage. They're another great power, and we will emphasize that. That being said, as Americans, we are here to compete with them, but we're not here to fight with them. We're not here to escalate with them. We're not here to, join World War III against China. We want to manage our competition, but ultimately we want to win that competition, which would be in economic and in those type of realms. Yes.
And to add on to that, I think that while one of these core American values is just maintaining a strong presence in the world, I think that there's also this idea that we should not go to war over something that is not necessarily a valuable use of our resources. I think that while the American public would want to go to war over Taiwan, I don't think that the American public wants to go to war over the second Thomas Shoal. And I think that making it very clear that going to war over an artificial island or going to war over a piece of water that is effectively useless to the United States is just not a productive use of resources. And I think additionally that part of we don't want to abandon the Indo-Pacific theater, but what we are arguing for is a strategic shifting away from the Indo-Pacific theater. Pete Hegseth thinks that the Indo-Pacific is the theater. We don't think that the Indo-Pacific is unimportant, but we don't think it is the theater. We think there are multiple theaters. And part of that, of course, is reaffirming the strategic importance of the war in Ukraine that has lost a lot of its love or lost a lot of its attention from the American people as well.
Yeah, And to the communication strategy part, I think the message, and we can tell the American voters, which I think is a true message, is that we are not going to passively wait China to be more cooperative. We are going to provocatively manage, steer, force China, use the strongest word possibly, to manage China to be more cooperative. For example, by cut its nationalism potentials. Without US provocation, it's very difficult for the communist regime to arouse a significant level of nationalism to fuel its ability and capability to be aggressive. Such rhetorics can be used, and I think it's a very strong way of expressing message, and it clearly demonstrates that the US is the leading side and is active side, and China is a passive receiving end. I think this message can be very persuasive to the American electorate.
If I just may answer the allies piece of this question, I think that one of the things we want to emphasize is, as we discussed in our presentation, we are not only concerned about Chinese aggression, we're also concerned about Taiwanese aggression. One of the reasons why we're not advocates for strategic clarity is because we don't want a continuation or escalation of what the Taiwanese president is currently doing, making loud statements of asserting independence, because that's exactly how China, which currently is not provoked to run the worst case scenario against Taiwan, that's exactly how they do that. I think we are equally as concerned about such statements from our allies in the Indo-Pacific. Right now, those countries are not very belligerent. They are not saying the same things necessarily, or maybe they're saying some of those things, but they're not actually engaging in those aggressive behaviors. And one of the reasons why, as Bria said, we are encouraging those allies to bolster the defense commitments without withdrawing from the region is because we don't want them to be aggressive. We don't want Japan to look at the situation and say, okay, the United States is absent from the region, we are now responsible for our own skin, therefore we need to start engaging in our own gray zone tactics.
Thank you.
Benjamin, is it really fair to equate kind of Taiwanese statements of national identity as the sort of same level of all the sort of China-shaped gray zone operations, violations of air identification zones, other things? I'm just wondering whether you're positing a sort of false equivalence in terms of where the tensions in the region are really coming from. Maybe elaborate on that a little more. By the way, let's stipulate, no one wants Taiwan to declare independence, and that is incredibly provocative, and there are things to worry about. I just wonder whether maybe your team is sort of being a little too balanced.
Can you clarify, you're asking if
You said a minute ago that you were equally concerned about Taiwanese aggression, which sounds a little bit of a sort of extreme view of what Taiwan and its current president is actually doing.
I mean, I can start this. I mean, it's a tough line to toe to not alienate our allies, and it may be a bad look for the U.S. to be, condemning Taiwan when China is clearly the aggressor in this situation. That being said, until we see boots on the ground invasion of Taiwan and naval blockade or an active war, we see all of these gray zone tactics as generally unnecessary and not really worth our time. I mean, largely, I think a lot of China's gray zone tactics are not necessarily precursors to a direct invasion, but also intimidation tactics of Taiwan. They want to lower Taiwanese morale, incite fear, those type of things. I think to react harshly against those would be unnecessary. And I mean, you can kind of see it as a gradient, a speaking tour might be lighter gray and, military drill over the island might be darker gray, but entirely, they're both gray.
Thanks, appreciate it.
We have time for round two?
Yes,
You?
and I think they've heard more than enough from me this week, so.
Okay, excellent. So I wanted to ask a couple of follow-up questions on the economic part of the argument and on the military part of the argument. So let's start on the military part of the argument. You're sensibly worried about provoking the PRC with military assistance to Taiwan. So what you're trying to do is to find some form of military assistance that isn't so provocative. And I'm I'd like to hear more about why it wouldn't be subject to the following potential counterargument. So if I were a paid representative of the PRC responding to your proposals for assisting Taiwan, I would argue that anything you do that improves Taiwan's ability to resist an invasion encourages Taiwanese movements towards independence. Because what you're doing is indemnifying the Taiwanese against the consequences of a politically aggressive move to separate themselves from their proper brethren on the mainland. So even if let's take an extreme version, even if what the United States does is we pay for the construction of an enormous brick wall all around Taiwan that cannot be moved outward and is resistant to any PRC attacks. I'm not actually proposing this, mind you. Even that would actually be aggressive, because what it's doing is it's enabling the Taiwanese to engage in political aggression at the grand strategic level by declaring independence, even though the stuff you're providing them at the tactical level is apparently defensive. So my question on the military side of things is, how confident are you really that you can identify some specific military assistance agenda that will not, in fact, provoke the PRC, or that should not, in fact, provoke the PRC? So on the economic side of things, you don't get off easy either. You advocate reduction of trade barriers. All for it. In fact, I think probably every last American is all for reduction of trade barriers. In fact, the Trump administration is all for the reduction of trade barriers. In fact, they argue that their entire trade war policy is a tactic to get trade barriers down, or at least sometimes they argue this. On Tuesdays, they have a different rationalization, but at least on Wednesdays, their argument, right, is that this tariff policy represents a threat that's designed to encourage the PRC to lower its tariff barriers. You don't like trade wars, you do like reduced tariff barriers. My question in light of that is, why are the trade barriers where they are now? Right, the United States prior to this administration has not been aggressively threatening reciprocal tariffs, and yet these barriers seem to exist, which implies, I think, that the PRC prefers them and would therefore presumably like them to continue, because they could always have unilaterally reduced them if they wanted to, but they did not. So my question for you then is, given that the PRC presumably has some reason to prefer their trade policy as it exists now, how would you go about changing it without engaging in trade war policies of threatened increases in tariffs on our side?
Can I ask a clarification?
Of course.
So, do you mean trade barriers from China, like stopping U.S. goods from entering China?
Well, you'll note that I'm using the term trade barrier rather than tariff, because there are many forms of trade barriers, not all of which are tariffs.
Yes.
Some are, some aren't. Some are regulatory policies that make it difficult for foreign products to compete. You could even argue that intellectual property law represents a form of it. So there are many kinds of trade barriers in addition to just tariffs, but pick your favorite. Right? I'm okay with choosing any of them. My question for you is, how are you going to get them down if you're not prepared to threaten U.S. increases in trade barriers as a means to get them to reduce theirs?
I can start. I mean, so your question points to a really fundamental issue with U.S.-China relations, which is that pretty much any movement can be taken by China as provocative and anti their interest. It's very hard to move to protect Taiwan. There's a fundamental ideological gap there. It's hard to protect Taiwan while making China happy. They're in conflict with each other. I think our general understanding of the situation is that we cannot sacrifice preparedness for caution. So we can't say, we can't sit back and appease China in the way of not allowing Taiwan to be prepared in drawing back from the region and whatever, and leaving Taiwan vulnerable. That's contra any interests. China is going to see any defensive weaponry buildup as, this is Taiwan trying to declare independence. And for that, we refer to, diplomacy and rhetoric. We say, Taiwan, you cannot declare independence. We are toning down our any statements alluding to separation. That being, and the bottom line of much of our military posture is making these capabilities effective. So it's not just that they're aiming to not be provocative, it's that Taiwan does have genuine security issues and they do need defense systems that will be able to repel an invasion if the event. We need to be prepared, and we can't really just sit back and say, well, that might provoke China. If we took that stance and followed all the way through, that would be the best case scenario for China. They would say, great, let's, they might just continue to take, as might say. So obviously it is a very tough line to toe, but we can't just draw back completely. That would be counterproductive.
If I may add on to that, if you look back at what Taiwan is asking for from the United States right now, they're looking for aircraft carriers, they're looking for F-16s. And if I'm President Xi and I'm saying, I can distract from my economic problems and stoke local nationalism by, what's Taiwan spending, what's Taiwan asking from the United States? And if those F-16s start appearing, then Xi Jinping has everything that he needs to rouse up that nationalism. The same thing goes for any statement that the Taiwanese president makes. That easily fosters that nationalism. Whereas if Taiwan is being given sea mines, it's a lot more difficult to make that claim to your people. Like this is a issue that Taiwan's gearing up for their defenses, but that's fundamentally significantly less threatening than the presence of something like an F-16.
And I think this is supported by empirical evidence. Like, nationalism is like a drug. It has a tolerance effect. If you constantly receive the same drug, you will be tolerant towards it. And the Chinese people is already, flooded with these minor, rhetorics and actions. These kind of things and the defensive tactics and behaviors from the US side is no longer provocative. It was provocative, but no longer. And may I ask the economic part of the question? Okay.
Oh, go for it.
So I think tariff as a strategy to reduce trade barriers from China, if it works, it is a great strategy. I would argue Trump is doing something good. But first, if we are thinking about a normal negotiation, the side that is more advantageous will be the winner side, right? And currently, as all the economic analysis suggests, US is more vulnerable towards a trade war. This is the first reason. And the second reason, the US has pressures from the stock market, from the business. The Chinese Communist regime has no such pressures. They are the only ruler. And so which makes the US to be a relatively weak side on the negotiation table. And the result suggests a similar pattern because China does not really significantly reduce its trade barriers. Also, the tariff strategy, even if it does work and US is more advantageous, as all other tactics, it is not without side effects. It is not without a bad side. And the bad side is it fuels nationalism, and which strengthens the communist regime and makes it has more leeway to invest in those things and the US don't want China to invest in. And second, there are better ways to reduce trade barriers from China. This is because the same barriers that prevent US goods from entering China also prevent US investment entering China, such as the exchange regulations and restrictions. And because China is so dire for foreign investment and all other kinds of money flowing from the rest of the world into China, it is naturally reducing barriers for this reason. And this is a consistent trend from China's side, and I think this is supported by lots of empirical evidence. Trade barriers is consistently being lowered, not because of tariffs, not because of the threats of tariffs, but because of other reasons, other cards in the US can play.
we're almost out of time, so Team B, I'll let you ask your question.
You did briefly mention gray zone tactics like in the military section. You talked about bolstering our allies in the Pacific to help them counter those more on their own. How do you envision that working? I don't know, maybe I missed something, but it just seems that is going to stoke tensions between our allies and China and make them more afraid of the threat. And if they feel like they're getting less support from us in those areas, do you think that can drive a wedge between us and our Pacific allies, like the Philippines?
Yeah, so good question. I mean, the gray zone tactics are called gray zone for a reason. They're tough to deal with. Generally, I think our posture is to not overreact to these gray zone tactics. We see them as they are. They're annoying. China bullies and harasses people in the South China Sea. They're frustrating. Our tactics are trying to de-escalate without appeasing China. So we're increasing surveillance and increasing, condemnation of these type of tactics, but we're not going to central our entire military posture around them because we think they're kind of a sideline to the greater regional stability. They're frustrating, they're annoying, but they're not the be-all, end-all of our policy in the region. Do you guys have anything to add?
I think another thing I would say is China isn't Russia. Russia is a country that is invading Ukraine, is invading a sovereign nation. China is a country that is occasionally firing water cannons at ships. Obviously, that's scary to the Philippines, but we think that our plan of both encouraging them to invest more in technologies that we think will better help them to defend themselves while also maintaining our presence in the region strikes the appropriate balance between, again, containing the Chinese threat without escalating it or without abandoning ourselves from the region.
All right, thank you, Team A.